They said she was dangerous. Not because she carried a sword or raised an army, though she would do both, but because she was a woman who remembered what power felt like and never learned how to give it back. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine. And long before the cage, long before the silence and the stone, she had been a queen of two kingdoms, a duchess of her own right, and the mother of kings, whose names would echo through time. She had ridden to war, negotiated with popes, married one king of France and then another of England, and yet the world would come to remember her not for what she ruled, but for where she was kept behind iron bars, in a cold tower, alone, not for 1 year, not for 2, but for 15 long, merciless winters, held not by a foreign enemy, but by the man who once vowed to protect her husband, her king, the one who kissed her crown before locking her away. Eleanor had not committed treason. She had not plotted with strangers, nor offered state secrets to foreign powers. What she had done, in the eyes of Henry II, was something worse. She had dared to resist. She had dared to speak. She had dared to turn her sons against him when he tried to strip them of what was theirs by right. And for that, for refusing to kneel, for choosing blood and justice over obedience and silence, he did not kill her. He did not put her on trial. He did not even allow the court to whisper her name. He simply made her disappear. In the year 1173, Eleanor of Aquitaine was seized while attempting to flee toward the French border, disguised in male clothing, her face hidden beneath a soldier's hood. Her destination, not sanctuary, but strategy. She was trying to reach Louis of France, her former husband, now an uneasy ally, to solidify support for the rebellion of her sons, Henry the young king, Richard, Geoffrey, but her escape failed. She was intercepted, unmasked, dragged not before a tribunal, but to a series of castles whose names were chosen not for their proximity to justice, but for their remoteness from pity. She was imprisoned first at Chinon, then Falaise, then Salisbury. It was at Salisbury Castle, in a solitary stone tower with no fire, and only a narrow barred window, that she would spend the majority of the next decade and a half, not as a prisoner of war, but as a wife rendered invisible by royal decree. There was no public announcement, no herald in the streets to explain the absence of the Queen, no parchment sealed with wax to declare her fate. She simply vanished from court. One day she stood beside her husband. The next, she was gone. Those who dared to ask were met with silence. Those who whispered were watched. Those who remembered too loudly were punished. And so the world learned to forget her. Inside the tower, Eleanor lived on what little they allowed her. 2 meals a day. Bread, stew, sometimes a scrap of meat. Water only once a week for washing. Her gowns, once the finest silks of Aquitaine, dulled and frayed over the years, threads loosening like the time she no longer measured. There were no mirrors, no combs, no letters, no books, no prayers in the chapel. Her companions were stone, dampère, and the creak of footsteps that were never friendly. She was 51 years old when the cell first closed behind her. By the time it opened again, she was 66. And still she remembered. She remembered the coronation of her first husband, Louis of France. The solemn vows whispered beneath the rose windows of a cathedral that had long since crumbled. She remembered the heat of Antioch during the Second Crusade, where rumors of her independence were deemed more dangerous than arrows. She remembered the annulment, signed in politeness and hidden fury, and the marriage to Henry, 11 years, her junior, a man she once thought she could shape, then realized she would have to survive. She remembered the birth of her sons, the pain, the pride, the moments they cried into her shoulder before they learned how to wear armor. She remembered Richard's fierce gaze, Geoffrey's clever mouth, Henry the young king's laughter like fire in a hall. She remembered teaching them to read, to think, to rule. And she remembered the day she turned their swords toward the man who shared their blood. She remembered every insult, every mistress, every betrayal, every moment she had swallowed rage in the name of diplomacy. And now, with nothing but time, she tasted them again, and Henry, who had once written her love letters now hidden deep in the archives of history, did not look at her again. He ruled, he fought, and negotiated. He slept with women half her age. He named favorites. He built alliances. But he did not visit. He did not write. He did not speak of her. She was a ghost with a beating heart. And still, he feared her. That is why he left instructions clear and cold, that even in the event of his death, Eleanor was not to be freed, that her silence must outlive him, that the cage must remain closed. But time is its own rebellion. When Henry died in the year 1189, it was Richard who rode to the tower and opened the door. And what emerged from the darkness was not a ghost, not a relic, not a shattered shell. It was Eleanor older, slower, scarred, yes, but alive, still standing, still sovereign. The queen who had been buried in stone had risen, and history, whether it wished to or not, I would have to remember her again. For this was not the story of a queen who lost. It was the story of a woman who was told to vanish and chose, instead, to wait. And now, the world would hear her name once more. Not whispered, not hidden, but spoken aloud. Eleanor of Aquitaine. The queen they tried to silence. The woman who would not break. Before the cage, before the iron doors and the stone walls, and the silence that swallowed years whole, there was a girl who rode horses like the wind, who spoke Latin like a priest, who learned statecraft, not from books, but from the bloodlines in her veins, and the echo of war drums outside the citadel of Poitiers. She was born Eleanor, daughter of William X, Duke of Aquitaine, and when he died in the year 1137, she became by birthright and blood the most eligible heiress in all of Christendom. At just 15 years old, she inherited not only vast territories, but a political weight that made kings whisper her name like a question, and nobles draw maps around her dowry. And before her childhood had faded from her features, she was married to Louis, son of the King of France, a boy raised to be pious, but not to govern, cloaked more in monastic cloth than royal armor. Theirs was a union of necessity, of strategy, of fire and ice thrown together in hopes of creating steam. He was contemplative, gentle, painfully devout, and dangerously unprepared. She was bold, sharp, restless, and built to move. Where he prayed, she questioned. Where he bowed, she rode. He sought salvation in silence. She found purpose in voice. And so their marriage, doomed by temperament and fueled by politics, became a slow unraveling, disguised as divine will. In the year 1147, when they rode together on the Second Crusade, not as lovers but as sovereigns, it was not the enemies of Christendom who came closest to destroying their union. It was each other. In Antioch, she wore no veil. She spoke in strategy. She lingered too long beside her uncle, Raymond, a prince and a soldier, a man whose mind moved like hers, and whose smile made the priests uncomfortable. Rumors bloomed like poppies in the desert. There was talk of impropriety, of treason cloaked in affection, of a queen who thought too much and obeyed too little. And Louis, humiliated, stripped of certainty, withdrew. He left early. She followed physically, not emotionally. And by the time they returned to France, their marriage had already turned to ash. In the year 1152, the union was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, though everyone knew the truth was not blood, but bitterness, and yet where most women would be broken, cast aside, reabsorbed into the veiled margins of history. Eleanor moved forward like a blade drawn in moonlight. 8 weeks after the annulment, she married again, not a prince, not a noble, but the future King of England, Henry Plantagenet. 11 years, her junior, red-haired, iron-willed, clever and volatile and hungry for the world. Their union was a storm made flesh. Political, yes, but also passionate. They did not merge politely. They collided. They locked. They set fire to the maps of Europe and redrew them in their image. With Eleanor's lands in the south and Henry's claims in the north, their holdings became an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. A dominion so vast and so rich, it made kings nervous and popes attentive. She became Queen of England in the year 1154, and from that moment, she was not simply consort, she was a sovereign force, ruling Aquitaine as her own, holding courts that defied tradition, hosting poots, thinkers, warriors, women of wit and learning, who came not to curtsy, but to converse. At Poitiers, she built more than a court. She built a world where courtly love and female intellect held weight. She encouraged troubadours to write not of conquest, but of loyalty and longing. She spoke of love as discipline, not surrender, and she ruled quietly, fiercely. But the very things that made her legendary made her dangerous to a world ruled by insecure men. Henry, for all his brilliance, for all his military genius and administrative reform, began to see not a partner, but a rival. Their marriage grew cold, then resentful. He took mistresses. She took silence. He gave commands. She gave none. And yet, she remained a queen. She raised 8 children. She trained them not just in swordplay, but in statecraft. She molded them into weapons sharper than steel. And when Henry began to favor their youngest John, a boy she never fully trusted over the older sons, she saw the fracture forming in the family, in the kingdom, in the legacy she had helped build. In the year 1173, when Henry moved to alter the succession in John's favor, bypassing Richard and Geoffrey, Eleanor did not protest in council. She did not write to Rome. She did what queens rarely dared. She conspired. With her sons, with foreign allies, with old friends and new enemies. She stoked the fire of rebellion, not with noise, but with calculation. She sent word to Aquitaine. She wrote to Louis, the king she had once left. She turned blood into resistance. It was not treachery. It was protection. It was the act of a mother who refused to watch her sons be reduced to pawns, of a queen who would not watch the dynasty she helped build become a ruin beneath her husband's vanity. But queens who rebel do not receive trials. They are not debated in Parliament. They are not given the dignity of martyrdom. They are erased. When Henry discovered her role, he did not argue. He did not confront. He ordered, and Eleanor, the woman who had once walked beside kings and crusaders, was captured disguised in a man's cloak, riding toward France. Alone, he stripped her of freedom, of contact, of court, but he did not strip her of name, because he could not, because Eleanor was not just queen by marriage. She was duchess by blood. She was sovereign by birth. And so he could not remove her, only hide her, lock her, silence her. And that is where the crown became a curse. Because what had lifted her to greatness also made her a threat, and what had made her a legend also made her vulnerable. The world would remember Henry as a great reformer, as a builder of systems, as the king who laid the groundwork for modern England, but Eleanor would remember him differently, as the man who could not bear to be challenged, as the husband who could not bear to be equaled, as the king who tried to turn a queen into a ghost. There comes a moment in every mother's life when love splits, when loyalty to one's children becomes a quiet declaration of war against everything that once felt stable. Unche felt sacred. Unche felt like home. For Eleanor of Aquitaine. That moment did not come in a nursery or beside a sickbed, but in a council chamber filled with murmurs and sealed letters, in the echo of a royal decree that sought to rob her sons of their inheritance and reshape a kingdom in the image of one man's fear. And so it was that the woman who had once given birth to kings decided, at last, to raise them into soldiers, not for conquest abroad, but for rebellion at home. By the year 1173, the cracks in the Plantagenet family were no longer hidden beneath diplomacy or ceremony. They ran openly across the royal court like fault lines ready to break. Henry, grown ever more possessive of his crown and increasingly mistrustful of his heirs, began to divide his lands not by order of birth or merit, but by favour. Richard and Geoffrey, both strong, both trained, both already governing territories in their own right, watched in disbelief as Henry shifted titles and territories toward John the youngest, the most malleable, the one most willing to be his father's puppet. It was not just injustice, it was insult, and Eleanor, who had carried these sons in pain, raised them in the image of power, and taught them to rule with both steel and mind. I saw the betrayal not just as a political strategy, but as a personal wound. She knew Henry. She had watched his mind for decades, had seen the way he collected influence like others collected gold, had watched how he turned affection into leverage, how even love, when offered to him, was measured against loyalty. He no longer saw his sons as legacy, but as potential threats. He no longer saw her as queen, but as memory. And so she chose her side. She chose blood. It began with letters written in her own hand, coded, carried by riders loyal not to the crown, but to Aquitaine, messages sent to Richard in Poitiers, to Geoffrey in Brittany, to Henry the young king who, though given a crown in title, had no real power to wield. Eleanor reminded them who they were, reminded them what had been promised. She did not speak in anger. She spoke in lineage, in duty, in the ancient right of sons to inherit and of mothers to defend. She called upon old alliances, those loyal to the Aquitanian line, those who had watched with unease as the king grew more suspicious, more controlling, more isolated, and she prepared. Aquitaine stirred like an old lion waking in the dark. Troops were raised not with banners, but with oaths whispered in moonlight. Fortresses restocked their armories. Towns sent word that the duchess had summoned them. And all across Henry's empire, from Normandy to Anjou, from Poitiers to Toulouse, the embers of rebellion waited only for a wind. And that wind came from France. Louis VII, her former husband, now King of France and father-in-law to her son, agreed, if not out of affection, then out of opportunity. A divided England benefited him. A distracted Henry weakened his borders. And so, quietly, the French crown offered support, money, safe haven, legitimacy. In the spring of that year, the sons rose. Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey declared rebellion against their father. They issued statements claiming the king had violated agreements, had bypassed traditions of succession, had treated them not as heirs, but as obstacles. It was not just a family quarrel. It was a war, and behind it, Eleanor stood not in armour, not with sword drawn, but in silence and strategy. Her rebellion was not forged in anger. It was carved from ice. Henry struck back with the fury of a man betrayed not only by enemies, but by blood. He moved swiftly, crushing uprisings in the north, securing loyalty in the south, imprisoning lords who hesitated in their allegiance. He marched through Aquitaine with fire and iron. And still, Eleanor stood firm, until they caught her. She was trying to leave for France, dressed as a man, her hair hidden, her bearing still regal. Some say she wore armor, others say only a long cloak. But when they stopped her, they saw through the disguise not because of her voice, but because of her eyes. They were too sharp, too knowing. Queens do not vanish easily, even in disguise. She was arrested, but not paraded, not executed. Henry would not make a martyr. Instead, he made her vanish. No trial, no public statement. She was taken away, silently, removed from the chessboard. And yet everyone knew. The court grew cold. The queen was gone, and the sons, though wounded, continued to fight. The rebellion ultimately failed. Henry the young king surrendered. Richard was forgiven. For now, Geoffrey remained aloof and calculating, and John, the favoured child, remained close to his father. The kingdom stitched itself together in appearance, but the tear beneath was deep, and Eleanor, she remained missing, locked away, castle to castle, her name only spoken in whispers, her face forgotten in tapestries, her presence replaced by shadows. The rebellion had ended, but the war, for here, had only just begun, because Henry would never forgive. Not truly. He feared what she represented: memory, will, defiance. She was not a queen to him anymore. She was proof that power could bleed. And so, for the next 15 years, he held her in the dark. But Eleanor, ever patient, ever watching, knew one truth better than any king. Time is not loyal to tyrants. It bends, it waits, and eventually, it returns to those who endure. And so it began, not with chains or screams or blood spilled across marble floors, but with a door that closed and did not open again. With a silence so thick, it became a presence of its own. With the soft click of a lock that echoed longer than thunder. Eleanor of Aquitaine. Once Queen of England, once Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, once ruler beside kings, and mother of princes who wore crowns. It was led into a stone room, no larger than a stable stall, and left there not for a day, not for a week, not for a season, but for 15 long, relentless winters that would stretch across the heart of her life, like a shadow laid in stone. She did not weep when the key turned. She did not plead. She simply stood still, quiet, watchful, like a bird learning the pattern of a new cage, her eyes scanning the curved walls, the single-barred window that let in too little light and far too much cold, the straw-covered floor, the wooden bench, the iron basin, the door made not to open, but to hold. There was no ceremony, no formal declaration, no sentence passed in court, just absence. Just one woman removed from the world, with the same quiet precision a king might use to move a piece off the board and pretend the game had not changed. And the days began. They came 2 at a time, divided by meals that were not truly meals, but measures of survival. Bread, often Stale, broth, often cold, sometimes a bone, rarely meat, and always silent. The guards were instructed not to speak to her, not to meet her eyes, not to acknowledge that the woman behind the door had once worn ermine and commanded armies. They were told to see a prisoner, not a queen. And yet, she remained both. She washed when they allowed it once a week, in water drawn cold from a well, poured into the basin without warmth or care. Her clothing, once fine and embroidered by the finest hands in Aquitaine, was left unchanged until the threads frayed and the seams opened. When they did bring new garments, they were plain, rough to the touch, cut for anonymity. No colours, no jewels, no sign of rank. She wrapped them around her body like skin she had not chosen. Seasons passed through the window like memories drifting just beyond reach. Summer came with dust, and the distant hum of bees. Scents that teased through the bars before fading again. Autumn came with sharp wind. Rusted leaves. A low sun that lingered briefly, then vanished. Winter pressed hardest, cloaking the stone in frost, tightening the air until it ached to breathe, biting her joints with a dull pain that never quite left. Spring was the cruelest, for it reminded her of what was growing elsewhere: flowers, armies, children, legacies, while she remained fixed in time. Untended and still, she paced the room in slow circles. Not to pass time, there was too much of it, but to remind herself that she still could. She recited poetry beneath her breath, remembered from courts that no longer sang. She traced the names of her sons in the dust: Henry, Geoffrey, Richard, John, as if writing them could bring their voices back. She sang sometimes, softly, old songs from Aquitaine that her mother once hummed while brushing her hair. Her voice cracked, but she sang anyway, because silence, left unchallenged, begins to eat. There were no mirrors, but she learned to feel the changes. Her fingers stiffened, her knees ached, her back bent, not from submission, but from cold. Her hair grayed at first in strands, then in waves. She wore it in braids, out of habit, not vanity. Her nails grew brittle, her skin thinned. She bled more easily, healed more slowly. Time did not wound her, it wore her. And still, she remembered. She remembered her wedding to Louis of France, the cathedral bright with candles, the weight of a crown placed not just on her head, but into her life. She remembered Antioch, the heat and the scandal, the look in Raymond's eyes when he saw her not as queen, but as equal. She remembered the cold annulment, the furious marriage to Henry, the birth of each child, the midnight screams, the lullabies, the first steps. She remembered Richard's stubborn mouth, Geoffrey's sharp wit, John's dark eyes. She remembered the court of Poitiers, the poetry of courtly love, the laughter of women unafraid. She remembered the rebellion, the letters, the betrayal, the chase, the capture, the cell. They tried to keep her from learning anything of the outside world. But walls do not seal thought. Guards, though silent, whispered to each other, and Eleanor listened. She heard the rumours, that Henry the young king had died, that Richard had gone to war, that Geoffrey had fallen in a tournament, that John was whispering at his father's side. She pieced together a world from fragments, from half-heard words and the shifting tension in the footsteps outside her door. She did not cry when she heard of her sons' deaths, not because she did not feel, but because she had forgotten how to weep without witness. And in all that time, Henry never came. Not once. He sent no messages, no apologies, no arguments. Just years. Just cold. Just the silence of a man who feared the woman he could not break. 15 winters. 15 years of rain hitting stone. Of bread left at the threshold. Of prayers whispered to an absent God. To of thoughts that began to echo until they felt like voices. 15 years without sunlight on her skin or the weight of another's hand in hers. 15 years of watching herself become memory. And then one day the door opened. Not with warning. Not with ceremony. Just the turn of a key. The groan of iron hinges. The scent of air that did not taste of stone. She blinked against the light. A figure stood in the doorway, tall, armoured, familiar. Richard. Not a boy. Not a prince. A king. He knelt, took her hand, said nothing, because what could be said? She rose not quickly, not easily, but with the quiet grace of a woman who had been waiting, not dying. And when she stepped out of that room, she did not look back. The tower would remain, but she would not. There are kings who conquer kingdoms and kings who rewrite laws, kings who build cathedrals and kings who start crusades. But history rarely pauses to ask, how many kings have feared a woman so completely that they chose to lock her away rather than face the sound of her voice or the memory of her gaze? Henry II, King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, husband to Eleanor of Aquitaine, was not remembered as a coward, not in the scrolls of monks or the ledgers of power, but he was a man haunted by a truth. No chronicler dared to write that the most dangerous rebellion he ever faced did not come from the battlefield, but from the woman who once shared his crown and his bed. They had once ruled side by side, not as equals, because Henry did not believe in equals, but as something close, something balanced in tension, like a sword and its sheath, like storm and stone. Eleanor had given him sons, heirs, lands, legitimacy. She had brought Aquitaine into his empire, secured alliances he could not have forged alone, and held her court in Poitiers, with a brilliance that drew poets and princes like moths to flame. But time relentless, inevitable war at the space between them. And when Eleanor raised her sons against him, not with sword in hand, but with strategy, letters, and loyalty, Henry did not see betrayal. He saw something worse. He saw defiance. He captured her with quiet rage, a fury colder than steel, and he never looked at her again. Not truly. Not directly. He moved her from castle to castle, from Chinon to Falaise to Salisbury, each one more remote, more silent, more designed not to punish, but to erase. He gave no explanation to his court. He allowed no mourning, no mention of her name, nor protest. He did not strike her in anger or condemn her in court. He simply removed her from the story. And that, for a man like Henry, was the sharpest punishment of all. But the cage he built for Eleanor was not made of stone and iron alone. It was woven from fear, pride, and something he never confessed: loss. He lost her long before the rebellion. Perhaps the first crack came when she refused to be silent in council, when she contradicted him in front of nobles, when she advised their sons in private. Perhaps it was when she told him he was wrong, not cruelly, not loudly, but clearly, with the tone of a woman who had ruled before him and would rule after. Or perhaps it was when she stopped forgiving, when she stopped explaining away his infidelities, when she saw Rosamond Clifford not as a woman, but as a mirror, reflecting how far Henry had drifted from the man she once chose. And yet, even after she was gone, he could not stop watching the shadow she left behind. He built up John, their youngest, as a replacement for the sons who rebelled. But John was a boy of hunger, not vision. He tried to shape Richard into obedience. But Richard was Eleanor's child more than his prey, loyal to the fire in his mother's blood. Geoffrey died too soon, leaving a silence Henry never filled. Henry the young king, once golden and eager, died in rebellion and regret. One by one, the future he tried to control slipped from his grasp, and Eleanor remained, not at his side, but in his absence, even locked away. She influenced the court, even in silence. She was remembered. Letters found their way to her. News travelled, slow but steady. She knew of the wars, the alliances, the deaths, the shifting ground beneath the crown, and Henry knew that she knew. He ensured she had no books, nor visitors, no servants who lingered too long. But he could not stop time. He could not stop thought. And so the years passed not as peace, but as slow attrition. Henry continued to rule, continued to rage, continued to build, to legislate, to plan, but somewhere in the quiet hours, when his hand hovered over maps or his mind drifted at prayer, Eleanor returned, not as a memory, but as a presence. She haunted his victories. She shadowed his failures. He had taken her voice, but not her weight. He had locked her body, but not her legend. He gave commands to keep her contained. Even in the event of his death, he wrote it clearly, precisely that she should not be released, that her silence must outlast his heartbeat, that her cage must remain shut, even after the keys passed to other hands. He believed this was security. He believed this was strength. But it was fear, and fear, like rot, spreads. By the year 1189, Henry was older, wearier, more brittle in both body and belief. His sons had turned on him. His allies questioned him, his kingdom strained beneath the weight of old battles and new debts. And as illness crept into his limbs, as breath grew short and rest elusive, he found himself surrounded not by legacy, but by ghosts. He died alone. No son at his bedside. No wife to hold his hand. Only guards. And shadows. He was buried with ceremony. Yes, with chants and marble. With a crown upon his coffin, and a lion carved into stone. But no monument could silence what he left behind. Because Eleanor lived, she lived beyond his reign, beyond his laws, beyond the walls he built to contain her. She lived not because of him, but in spite of him. And when Richard, her son, rode to Salisbury and opened the door, she stepped out into the world, not as a widow, not as a prisoner, but as the one thing Henry could never make her free. She did not speak of him often in the years that followed. When she did, her words were few, precise. She called him the king. Never my husband. She spoke of treaties, not affections, of actions, not intentions. And yet, those who watched her closely, who saw the flicker in her eyes when his name was mentioned, understood that some wounds do not weep. They calcify. Eleanor did not bury Henry. That task fell to others. But she did return to court. And when she sat in the council chambers once more, when she held the seals, when she issued decrees and signed letters, and ruled on behalf of her son, she did so with a hand that had not forgotten the chill of captivity, with a voice that no longer needed volume to carry power, and with eyes that had looked into the darkest part of a king's heart and endured, because in the end, the cage was never hers. It was his. He built it. He lived within it. She simply survived it, and when he was gone, when the walls cracked and the stones fell silent, it was Eleanor who remained, still standing, still sovereign, still herself. When the door opened and the light returned after 15 years of stone and silence, Eleanor did not rush forward, did not fall into arms or cry out with joy, did not curse the walls or the man who had vanished beneath them instead. She rose slowly, as if rising from beneath water, her limbs uncertain, not because they were weak, but because they had forgotten what space felt like, what light could do to skin that had grown accustomed to dimness. And in that stillness, when the sun struck her face for the first time in over a decade, she did not smile, but closed her eyes and let it pass over her like memory, like judgment, like absolution. It was Richard who opened the door. Richard, the third son, the soldier son, the one they called the Lionheart. Not just for the way he fought, but for the way he remembered. The son who had inherited not only his mother's cheekbones, but her defiance, her clarity, her refusal to kneel where truth was twisted. He did not bring trumpets or crowds. Only a key and a single hand held forward. Not to pull her from the cell, but to wait, to offer, to let her decide what came next. because he understood what no man at court had ever grasped, that to be imprisoned is not only to be contained, but to be watched. And that release is not an act of mercy, but a moment of return. And so Eleanor returned, not in chains, not in triumph, but in presence. She returned to a court that no longer knew her face, to servants who had never bowed to her voice, to noblemen who had risen in her absence, and thought the crown belonged only to kings who spoke loudly and acted quickly. She returned wearing black, not for mourning but for memory, her silver hair wrapped high, her steps measured, her hands gloved not for warmth but for the sake of the gesture, because the woman who had been stripped of titles and seasons and names had come back not to reclaim a throne, but to remind it that she had never truly left. Richard was crowned in the year 1189, and from the moment the crown touched his head, he did what his father would never have done. He placed his mother not behind him, but beside him, not in shadow, but in light. When he departed for the Third Crusade, he did not leave the kingdom in the hands of a cousin or a cardinal or a loyal knight. He left it to Eleanor. At 67 years old, after a decade and a half of confinement, she was named Regent of England, given seal and authority, trusted not because of blood, but because of history. And she ruled, not with shouts, not with spectacle, but with silence sharpened into steel. She did not need to threaten. She did not need to remind. She simply appeared, and the room changed. She travelled from palace to priory, from fortress to field, from London to Winchester. She moved through the land like a shadow restored to form. Her horse was steady, her posture upright, despite the pain in her joints. Her eyes clearer than those half her age. She heard petitions, balanced accounts, settled disputes between barons who had spent too long grasping for power in her absence. She answered letters from foreign courts, negotiated loans for the crown, kept nobles loyal, while her son warred under distant suns. And when Richard was taken captured and held for ransom by the Holy Roman Emperor, the lion heart chained in foreign hands, Eleanor, now in her 70s, did not banit, did not pray for miracles. She rode across the cold roads of Europe. She travelled not as queen or mother, but as an envoy of necessity. She met with kings who had once laughed at her silence. She stood in halls where her name had once been forbidden. She argued in Latin, bargained in French, wrote in English, and when gold was needed for her son's ransom, she gathered it not with royal edicts, but with a mother's quiet fury. She called upon every ally, every abbey, every town that remembered what justice sounded like. She accepted coins from peasants, jewels from nuns, promises from bishops who feared her gaze more than excommunication. And when the price was raised, she raised it again, piece by piece, ounce by ounce. She rebuilt the worth of a son stolen from her, not because of glory or war or divine right, but because he had opened the door, and that was a debt she would never leave, unpaid. When Richard returned, scarred but breathing, he kissed her hand once more, not as regent, not as subject, but as the woman who had done what no army could do. She did not ask for thanks. She did not ask for more. She simply returned to her letters. But time gentler now still moved forward. Her body ached more than before. She slept less. She walked with a cane. Not because she was frail, but because she had walked too far on too many roads for too many years. Her hair was white now, her skin paper thin, but her presence, oh, her presence was undiminished. Children still paused when she entered a hall. Men still lowered their voices. Women still watched her with a mixture of reverence and fear. She had become something more than a monarch. She had become the memory of what power could endure. And even as Richard ruled, even as England shifted and swelled beneath the weight of returning war, Eleanor remained at court, in letters, in treaties, In whispers, they called her the Lionheart's mother. But she had always been the heart behind the lion. She had outlived her husband. She had outlived 2 sons. She had outlived the bars meant to bury her. And now, she stood at the edge of the world. She once ruled, watching the next chapter rise like mist off the hills. She did not claim it. She did not cling to it. She simply turned her face toward the wind and let it pass through her. Because she knew better than anyone that to rule is not always to hold. Sometimes, it is to survive. There are victories that taste of wine and song and sunlight through stained glass. Victories that are sung in halls and carved into stone. Victories that come with crowns and open gates. But there are other kinds of victories too. Quiet and cold. Made not of glory but of grit. Earned not by sword or strategy, but by enduring when every voice said to yield. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, long past the fire of youth, and long past the pain of prison, had lived long enough to learn that survival itself is not always a blessing. For the price of survival is not paid in silver or in land, but in memory, in silence, in the unbearable act of outliving everything you once loved. By the time Richard had returned to England, scarred from captivity, older, more brittle in his pride, but no less golden in his legend, Eleanor had already begun to feel the quiet crumble of time inside her bones, not as pain, not as illness, but as the slow unraveling of connection, as if the threads that tied her to this world were fraying one by one, not breaking, just slipping from her hands before she had time to hold them tighter. She had lost Geoffrey years before. His clever mind extinguished too young in the confusion of tournament and treachery. She had lost Henry the young king to rebellion and fever. A son who had worn the crown before. He knew how to carry its weight, whose laughter still echoed in the corners of her memory like light on cold stone. Now, even Richard, her proudest, fiercest, the most loyal child, stood as a man forever marked by battle and captivity. And Eleanor, watching him from across the long tables of council or the quiet corridors of palace stone. He saw not just a king, but a man already fading, already burning too hot to last. And she knew, as only a mother can know, that time would not spare him either. She had returned to power. She had ruled again. She had saved her son. But nothing comes without cost. The cost, for Eleanor, was love itself. She had learned to love differently without expectation, without possession, without the illusion that presence meant permanence. She had stopped asking for longevity and instead had begun to hold on to flashes, a word spoken between council sessions, a letter received before dawn, a ride through fields where the wind still knew her name. She loved in fragments now. In the spaces between absence and duty, she wore black more often than before, not always for mourning. But because it simplified the weight of being seen, because it turned her into shape and shadow rather than statement, because it allowed her to move like memory rather than monarch. And yet, even in black, even with her hands gloved and her voice quieter, she was not diminished. Servants still rose when she passed. Nobles still stilled their speech. Ava kings, visiting from other courts, paused before speaking in her presence, unsure whether to call her Majesty, Dowager, or something else entirely, because she had become something else entirely. Not queen, not widow, not mother, but witness. And the world, she realized, does not know what to do with a woman who remembers everything. When Richard rode to war again because kings like him were never meant for peace, Eleanor did not stop him. She kissed his forehead, once, beneath a banner of gold, and watched him disappear down a road. She had walked too many times in dreams. She did not pray. She simply waited. When the news came that he had died, felled not by sword in battle, but by a bolt during siege, a wound that festered while his court scrambled to find someone to blame, she did not weep. Not because she didn't ache, but because she had no tears left to give to death. She had become too familiar with it. It had visited her too many times, in too many forms, and always it left the same silence behind. And so she did what she had always done. She moved forward. She arranged his burial with dignity. She ensured the realm did not fracture in his absence. She met with nobles, calmed the church, and stood firm when John, the last remaining son, now ascended the throne, not because he was worthy, not because she believed in him, but because there was no one else left, and the throne, like the sea, must always be filled. John was a different creature altogether, not brilliant like Geoffrey, not gallant like Richard, not tragic like Henry the young king. He was uncertain, ambitious, restless, and worst of all, suspicious. He did not trust Eleanor, not because she had betrayed him, but because she had survived too much. He saw in her not protection, but prophecy, and so she withdrew. Not in disgrace, not in silence, but in choice. She returned to Fontevraud, not to hide, but to rest. It had been so long since she had rested. There, among the cool cloisters and the stone corridors echoing with footsteps, she did not need to follow. Eleanor found something like stillness. She walked in the garden each morning, leaning on a cane, her head covered, not out of modesty but comfort. She watched the sun move across the walls like a prayer that needed no words. She read when her eyes allowed it. She listened to the nuns sing in the early evening, and did not interrupt. She no longer needed to speak to be heard. And in that stillness, the cost of survival began to settle. She dreamed more, in her dreams. She was often young, riding through the hills of Aquitaine, wind at her back, laughter in her throat. Sometimes she was at court, debating poots, correcting bishops, raising her son's hands in triumph. Other times, she was in the tower again, walking in circles, counting cracks in the stone, listening for a key that would not come. She did not fear these dreams. She welcomed them, because they were hers. She had earned everyone. The world outside changed. New kings were born, new wars began. But inside Fontevraud, the days moved slowly, measured, gentle. She wrote a few letters still, to grandchildren, to abbots, to women who asked for guidance. She never gave orders. She only gave stories. And stories, as she had always known, last longer than kings. As her body weakened, as the cane became less of a tool and more of a companion, as her steps shortened and her hands trembled more often, Eleanor began to understand that survival had not been about waiting for peace. It had been about preparing the world for memory. Because when power fades, memory begins. And memory, when protected, is the longest reign of all. History has a way of folding its pages neatly, of tucking inconvenient stories into the margins, kind of smoothing over the rough edges of truth until the record reads like liturgy, and the people in it seem less like blood and bone and more like statues in candlelight. And Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen. Prisumna, Mother. The regent knew better than most that the ink which stains parchment is not always the same as the memory which stains the soul. She had lived the events that would one day be written down by men who had never seen her eyes. By scribes loyal not to truth, but to legacy. By priests who preferred obedient saints to defiant queens. They would record the dates, the treaties, the coronations, the crusades. They would write of Henry II, not as the man who locked away his wife for 15 years, but as a reformer of law, a builder of justice, a father of empire. They would write of Richard the Lionheart, not as the boy who opened a prison door, but as the warrior king who rode to Jerusalem and fought with God in his heart and iron in his hand. They would write of John as the king who lost a crown and signed a charter, as if that were the whole of his inheritance. But Eleanor, they wrote of her lightly, like shadow, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much, too many contradictions, too many truths that did not flatter the world they had built. Because what do you do with a woman who ruled before her husbands? What do you do with a queen who went to war against her own king? What do you do with a prisoner who outlived her sentence, returned to the throne, and bent a kingdom back into shape with nothing more than memory and will? You write around her. You mention her in passing. You reduce her to a mother, a consort, a relic. And so they did. They praised her piety in old age. They admired her composure. They buried the tower beneath silence. And yet even in their restraint, even in the gaps they revealed her, because the things left unwritten speak louder than the things declared, because her absence in the record is its own form of testimony, she became a question, a rumor, a ripple, a name spoken in the halls of women, in the letters of nuns, in the memories of those who served quietly and remembered vividly. The chroniclers recorded her as attending Richard's court in her later years, as intervening in his captivity, as arranging his ransom, but they never described the night rides through snow, the bargaining behind stone walls, the way she trembled, not from fear, but from cold and age and determination. They recorded that she retired to Fontevraud, but not that she did so with the weight of generations behind her, that she carried within her the ghosts of 5 sons, a kingdom fractured, and a memory sharpened like the edge of a broken crown. They did not write of how she watched the world shrink as she grew older, how the names on the council lists became strangers, how the young women at court whispered her name with wonder, but did not dare ask what it had cost her, how the letters from kings grew shorter, less frequent, how the candlelight grew brighter as her eyes dimmed. But Eleanor wrote, not voluminous, not declarations, just letters private, deliberate, slow. Some survived, some were hidden, some were burned. In one, addressed to a granddaughter, she wrote silence. When chosen is strength, but when forced, it is a wound that never closes. In another, she warned a young noblewoman, they will call you proud, they will call you dangerous, they will call you disobedient. Let them. You will still be here when they forget why they feared you. And in the margins of one missive, never sent, she wrote, they buried me once. I did not stay. She knew what she had become. She had become the quiet echo that undermined certainty, the living proof that women endure not by permission, but by practice, the memory too large to forget and too sharp to frame neatly. She had outlived every man who tried to silence her. She had watched as the world built their statues and told their tales, and she had smiled, not because she had lost, but because she knew the truth would never truly stay buried, because time is a storyteller, and time, like Eleanor, remembers. And so tonight, as you lay beneath your blankets and listen to the sound of your own breath, remember this, that there are stories we are taught, and there are stories we inherit through silence, through intuition, through the steady hum of things not said, but always known. Remember that in every gap in the record, there is a voice like hers, waiting, a queen, a prisoner, a mother, a shadow in the chronicle, but never forgotten, never truly gone. There are women who disappear quietly, who fold themselves into history like pressed flowers between pages of books no longer read, whose names dissolve into dust because they were never spoken with reverence. But Eleanor of Aquitaine was never one of them, for she was not made of silk or shadow, or the soft things that time erases. She was built of stone and storm and the ancient rhythm of footsteps echoing through long corridors of power. And though the world tried again and again to reduce her to a role, a title, a silence, she never once surrendered to the version of herself they tried to write. They buried her at Fontevraud, beneath the vaulted ceilings and the murmurs of monks. beside the stone likeness of her beloved son and the cold carving of the king who once locked her away. But even in death, Eleanor lies differently. Her effigy is not veiled or praying, but open-eyed, with a book in her hands and a spine still straight, as if she knew that her story was not over, that even in the hush of the tomb, the pages would keep turning and her voice would keep slipping through the cracks in history's carefully closed doors. And maybe that is how she always knew to survive, not by hiding from power, but by holding it in her palm and knowing when to let it go. Not because she was weak, but because she understood what so few kings ever learned, that endurance is not submission, and silence is not defeat, and that the deepest strength lies not in striking but in standing, again and again, until the world realizes it cannot make you fall. She had been a duchess before she was a bride, a queen before she was a mother, a ruler before she was a prisoner, and though they stripped her of crown and comfort, and years that could never be returned, they never took her mind, her memory, or her refusal to vanish. And now, as the world sleeps and the candles dim and you lie still with the weight of your own years, your own regrets, your own quiet rebellions, perhaps you feel something of her, some part of that voice that never cracked, that gaze that never dropped, that hand that never begged for pardon, even when every door was closed. Perhaps you see now that what they feared in her was not her power, but her permanence, not her defiance, but her refusal to disappear into a footnote, because Eleanor did not break, not in the tower, not in the court, not in the loneliness of her final winters. She became the ghost that haunted thrones and the echo that lingered in lore. She became the breath behind every woman who ever stepped forward when told to step aside. She became the mother of kings and the memory of queens and the silence that no one could ever quite silence. And so we remember her not just in books, not just in statues, but in the very fact that we are still telling her story, in the whisper of her name across centuries, in the knowledge that she endured and endured and endured, and in doing so, taught the world that a woman need not win to be victorious, nor speak to be heard, nor rule to remain. Tonight, let her memory rest beside you like a flame that does not flicker. Let her silence speak louder than any cry, and let her strength carved not in stone, but in story remind you that even in your stillest, smallest moments, there is something unbreakable within you too. Good night, my dear listener, and may you dream of queens who rise, not from thrones, but from the ashes of every cage that tried to keep them.